You better know what the purpose of the workout is, and the way that the workout is designed should in fact fit that purpose. And it should be better than, well, that's how I did it.
That Triathlon Show 166. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Jason Koop, who is the Director of Coaching at Carmichael Training Systems. He is really a wealth of knowledge and experience in endurance sports coaching, having coached a lot of age group triathletes, runners, cyclists, etc., but also being one of the most reputable ultra running coach, having coached many of the best ultra runners in the sport today. So what we'll talk about today, it's a general training talk, so we go into a variety of different topics about how to train better as an endurance athlete. But some specific things include how much or actually how little fitness should you lose or allow yourself to lose in the off season, why you must know the purpose of every single workout and block of training that you plan, whether you're a coach or a self-coached athlete. And we dive deeper into run training structure for triathletes, since Jason is a very knowledgeable runner, and that's his background as an athlete. So how can triathletes structure their run training to become better at the running leg? And we go into some common mistakes that age group triathletes make, and some current fads in triathlon and endurance sports. But before we do that, a big thanks to our sponsors. First, we have Retül. That is a bike fitting system that uses the proprietary Retül Vantage 3D motion capture technology, so that it accurately can measure every degree of movement and every millimeter of distance during your bike fitting session. And this provides both you and your bike fitter with data to support the choices that are made during the bike fit, for you to get the best possible end result in your bike fit and your experience on the bike after that. And I think personally it's very cool when you can see in real time on a big screen these small changes in distances and angles, and when you see those pop up, and then especially when you start to feel how making even a millimeter change can suddenly make you feel so much more comfortable and powerful on the bike. I think that is something that is pretty cool and insightful. You can learn more about the Retül Bike Fit process on retul.com/TTS, as in That Triathlon Show, and Retül is spelled RETUL. Find out more about the process and find your authorized Retül Experience Center near you. Thank you also to Precision Hydration. They make electrolyte products that help you get hydrated and stay hydrated so that you don't have to suffer from cramps and impaired performance as the workout goes on. Now that we are in full-on winter training in the Northern Hemisphere, you are most likely stuck indoors on the turbo trainer, or you might even do a lot of work on the treadmill. And as we talked about in some episodes in the past, since you do not have a lot of airflow, this of course depends on if you're using a very powerful fan, then that can improve the situation quite a bit or a lot. But in many situations, you might have a fan that is not that powerful, especially on those treadmills in gyms. And for many age group athletes in general, at home you might not have room for that industrial fan, or it might not look that pretty in your living room if that's where you do your bike training. So the point is that you are likely sweating a whole lot when you're training indoors because you don't have airflow, and you are losing a lot of sodium and other electrolytes through that sweat. And to have a productive workout, you need to make sure that loss of electrolytes isn't going to limit you in the latter stages of the workout. So check out the Precision Hydration electrolytes. You can get your first box for free with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, on precisionhydration.com. And Precision Hydration is now also available in New Zealand and Australia. All right, so let's get right into the interview with Jason Koop. I'm here with Jason Koop, Director of Coaching at Carmichael Training Systems. Jason, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
You are a coach of many different strengths. You coach a lot of elite ultra runners. That's how I first learned about you, actually. But then I found out when I was looking more closely at your profile on the Carmichael Training Systems website that you do also coach triathletes and cyclists. So how have you come into endurance sports from the start? What's your background?
Yeah, so my background is originally in running. I ran in junior high school, and then at the collegiate level, I was a very mediocre runner at best at a Division I school here in the United States. And I started coaching track and field athletes, youth track and field athletes in my early 20s, and then transitioned to coaching all different types of endurance athletes, mountain bikers, cyclists, triathletes, Ironman athletes, and then kind of ultra runners in I would say in the mid or late 2000s.
So for the cyclists and triathletes, did you also start doing that yourself, or did you coach without actually being a cyclist or triathlete at that point?
A little bit. I kind of dabbled in the sport. I actually did the Leadville Trail 100 mountain bike race way before I did the Leadville Trail 100 run, which is a kind of a little known fact, but not to a significant extent, just mainly for my own personal enjoyment.
So what are some tips that you could give to coaches that might be in the same situation, or what did you find that helped you coach people in sports that were not necessarily your bread and butter that you had been doing every day of your life, like you had running for a long time at least?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate that I had just an incredible array of very high quality mentors when I first started coaching. And I thought when I was kind of getting into coaching as a profession that I kind of knew it all. I had a degree in biochemistry and genetics from a major university. I was an incredible student of all different types of endurance sports and read all the training books and philosophies and things like that. I had a lot of national governing body certifications and went to all the clinics and seminars and kind of you name it. But what I learned, really, really quickly, just in the environment that we have here at CTS and just being located here in Colorado Springs, proximate to the Olympic Training Center here, is that there's just really no substitute for having high quality mentors that have worked with hundreds of the best athletes, the highest caliber athletes for decades, kind of helping to guide you in this case me in my kind of coaching practice. So if there's really one thing I could offer anybody, it's just go out and develop a set of mentors that you can really lean on.
That's really great advice. So let's dig into some training questions that we have on the agenda for today. And some of these come from, we want to give credit where credit's due to the Strength Running podcast. And I heard an interview that you did recently there and discussed a couple of topics that I thought we might go into here as well. The first one of them is about how much fitness should you lose or not lose when fitness is cyclical and you go through different periods of the season, but you have your approach to this. And can you tell us about that?
Sure. So first off, all athletes need downtime, and however you want to classify that as a transition phase or an off season or a regeneration phase. There's all this different kind of vocabulary that coaches and athletes use to describe that. I think it's necessary for all athletes to go through a period where they're off of their peak fitness. But I like to keep the athletes that I work with within about 10% of their peak fitness, regardless of how you're kind of monitoring that, whether you're looking at training or you've got some sort of litmus test that you're going to use or whatever. And I find that 10% number, it's a little bit anecdotal, and it's just kind of based off of just what I've seen athletes kind of react best to throughout the course of many years, kind of building training cycles. And the biggest thing with it is it just prevents an athlete from really digging too far out of a kind of a fitness hole whenever the next season is kind of up. Now that 10% fitness decline can really happen over a kind of a span of weeks or even months. I mean, it could happen over 3 weeks, over 4 weeks, over 6 weeks, over 8 weeks, or over 12 weeks. The time frame really is kind of inconsequential, but the absolute amount that I'll really allow my athletes to their peak fitness to deteriorate, really, it kind of teeters right around 10%.
Yeah. And at first, when I heard that number, it sounded like the first reaction is that it sounds like a lot. And I think that was sort of the point of that interview. But then when you actually, that it does not sound like a lot. It sounds like you're kind of going against the stream here with that advice. But then when you really start thinking about it, let's say your typical easy running pace is 5 minutes per kilometer, which would be 8 minutes per mile. Then that becomes, when you're not at peak fitness, that becomes 5 minutes 30 or 8:48, I guess, in mile pace.
Yeah.
So it is still that there is a large range there, and which definitely allows for a wide range from when you're not at peak fitness to being at peak fitness.
Yeah, and the other thing I always emphasize with that is it doesn't take much to hold on to that 10%. I mean, it even in the most kind of highly trained athletes where they're coming off of the peak, they don't need to do much to kind of stay within that, 90% as good as they were at their very best. So a lot of people have that same reaction that you just had, where they think it's a lot, but then once they do the math on it, they're like, oh yeah, that's totally reasonable to do.
Yeah. So what's your advice then for how to hold on to that? Is that through just consistent, less volume training, or do you like to add some less volume still but high intensity, or do you have any special approach to that? And what about a complete period off, like no training whatsoever? How long do you recommend, if at all, that athletes take such a period?
Yeah, I don't like athletes taking like a whole bunch of 0 days in a row. Maybe they go for a week or 10 days or something like that where they're totally off, and that's fine. But I don't like to stretch it out into too much longer than that, because it really doesn't take that much. I mean, really, if you just get out for 5 kilometers or 30-minute bike ride or a 40-minute bike ride or something, very, very, very small, it actually makes a big impact during that phase. And I just like to bring everything down. I like to bring the volume down. I like to bring the intensity down. I like to bring the frequency down, kind of all of the above, and really look at kind of a minimum value proposition of workload that you can put in front of the athlete that, to where they're just not deteriorating too much, and kind of alongside that, I also want them to do activities that are going to regenerate their enthusiasm, because a lot of times when you go through the grind of a season or maybe a few seasons in a row, it just gets to a lot of athletes, in particular a lot of high caliber athletes, where they've just got their nose to the grindstone, weeks and kind of months out of the year. And sometimes, this transition phase can serve as a kind of a regeneration of their kind of enthusiasm for training and for the races that they've got coming up.
What might be some examples of those activities?
I mean, it's really simple. 30 minutes of easy running, 20 minutes of easy running, 60 minutes of easy cycling. I mean, really, it's honestly not any more complicated than that.
I talked about the rejuvenating, the ones that will reinvigorate the enthusiasm, but that's still, you still consider those running or cycling activities as those, but just short and easy ones.
Well,
you're not talking about, for example, backcountry skiing or whatever you might be doing there in Colorado Springs.
No, well, there's not a lot of backcountry skiing here in Colorado Springs. There is, just over the Front Range. But if those activities are what is necessary to regenerate that enthusiasm, great. I mean, I typically prefer them to be aerobic activities versus, power activities like going and playing ultimate frisbee or basketball or, something like that. But the point is to do things that the athlete feels that is going to kind of regenerate their enthusiasm for the year. And so, and most of the times just by bringing down the workload, and sometimes that workload is reduced by 75%. You have an athlete that's training 15 or 20 hours a week, and then all of a sudden they go down to 5 hours a week. And sometimes that extra physical bandwidth that they have then freed up from going from 15 or 20 hours a week down to 5 hours a week of training, sometimes that alone, is enough to kind of reignite the fire that's underneath them.
Yeah. So the other topic that you talked about on that strength running podcast was about planning workouts or using workouts that maximize the amount of work that you do at a given intensity. I'm not sure that I'm actually getting this quite right, so I'll let you just elaborate on what it was that you were talking about and explaining it for us.
Sure, and I think the question kind of came about. It really revolved around how do you determine the specific workout architecture, and I'll kind of broaden that back up and tie into a little bit of a theme that I talked about earlier, and that's just having really good mentors. Is one of the reasons, or one of the ways that these early mentors that I had a big influence on me, is that they would consistently, and I would actually use the word relentlessly, ask me the question of why. Why was I doing the things that I was doing? Why was a recovery run 45 minutes? And why was it not 30 minutes or not 75 minutes? Why was this workout 5 by 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, and not 6 by 3 minutes on, 3 minutes off, or 15 by 1 minute on, 1 minute off? And by kind of focusing on that relentless question of why, it really forces you as a coach to kind of hone down on making sure that whatever you're prescribing to the athlete is being done so very, very intentionally. And to kind of correlate that to your question, it's really not so much of a question of maximizing the amount of work that's being done, because anybody can just pile on work. Sometimes that's the case, but it's really more maximizing the benefit or the intended benefit for what you're trying to do. So I'll give you kind of two examples of that, of where you can kind of pick and choose a different workout architecture and you can have a completely different consequence. One of the ones that we were focusing on the Strength Runner podcast was a progression run. And I'm generally not a fan of progression runs, and I'm not a fan of them specifically because the amount of quality work, or the quality work that's being done in a progression run, is always less than if you design that same run with the quality work at the beginning. So if you ask an athlete to do a run and then a 6-mile progression run at the end of their 13-mile long run or something like that, and you compare that with putting that six miles of effort at the beginning of the run, those 6 miles are always going to be faster because they're in a pre-fatigue state if you do the 6 miles at the beginning of the run. So you're automatically having just a higher quality of workout. The other thing that can happen is you could actually do more work, right? So instead of doing 6 miles at X pace at the end of the run, you could probably do 7 miles or maybe 7.5 miles at the same pace at the beginning of the run, because you're not in that pre-fatigue state. But once again, I learned to look at workouts through this lens because of this consistent kind of question of why that these mentors were asking me. The second way is just in terms of how you design the specific workload, and you can take two workouts that have an identical amount of time at intensity, and they have completely different results. And the example I always give is you can prescribe a workout and say, I want this athlete to go 15 times 1 minute hard, 1 minute easy. So they're accumulating 15 1-minute intervals at a very, very high intensity throughout the course of the workout. Or you can say, I'm going to do 5 times 3 minutes hard, 3 minutes easy. Same time and intensity in both of those examples, 15 minutes. But the 5 times 3 minutes hard, 3 minutes easy is going to be the workout that really stresses and maximizes the cardiovascular system and kind of taps into, more of the athlete's VO2 max versus the 15 times 1 minute on, 1 minute off. Now, you could have a completely different rationale for prescribing that 15 by 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or a progression run. But you have to be certain that that rationale actually fits the way that you are, in fact, designing the specific workout for the athlete.
Yeah, tons of great points here. I have been prescribing progression runs for quite a few people that I coach, especially when I've been coaching runners or coaching triathletes in a run specific block, perhaps for a half marathon. And I started thinking when you were talking about the why behind it, and when I asked myself why, it's probably because I felt that I had a lot of improvements as a runner when I was doing progression runs, but I didn't have any better rationale than that, really. So it's a great mindset to take to really ask why you're doing things. And I guess that you're following, or I know actually that you're following Paul Larsen and Martin Boucher and their work with interval training, and that's a great example of how to use the same time and intensity in different ways and get very different results. So Paul is actually he has been a guest in the past, and he's coming on again to talk about their work. But that's a really good example as well, that yes, you can do similar things but get very different results.
Well, and I'll just to pick on you for a little bit. Like, we have this type of conversation in our coaching group all the time. Like, why did you do this? Why did you do that? It's not uncommon for a coach, especially our new coaches, to go, well, that's just because what I did and I improved a lot. That's a horrible reason to prescribe a workout based on your personal experience. If that's the only thing you got, that's the only thing you got. But you bet, I always strongly encourage our coaches to have a better reason than that. You better know what the purpose of the workout is, and the way that the workout is designed should in fact fit that purpose. And it should be better than, well, that's how I did it.
What different variables and constraints would be the most important ones to consider whether you're a coach or a self-coach athlete, when you plan your training? Where do you start when you go about planning your training?
Well, if you take a look at from a season perspective, I'll take like the big lens approach first, and then we'll kind of narrow down to the smaller, like week-long lens. But if you look at an entire season, typically what we're trying to do is, and this is more particular in an ultra running setting than a triathlon setting, but we're typically trying to do is we're trying to tap into the physiology that is least specific to the events that the athlete is preparing for, furthest away from the event. And then we're tapping into the physiology that's most specific to what they're training for, closest to the event. And so in a very literal way, you're going from least specific to most specific. Most of the times in an ultramarathon setting, and the really caveats to this, or the exceptions to this, would be an elite ultramarathoner who's preparing for like a 50K, 100K, or a 50-mile type of race where they're just so good that this isn't quite the case. But most of the times in an ultramarathon setting, that just means that your high intensity stuff is early and your low intensity, higher volume stuff is late. And then when you're going down to the level of, the week or the phase, or however you're kind of designing that individual's training, you really have to look at, okay, do these goals actually match that architecture that you have set up from the onset in terms of what you're actually trying to do? So in a very in a very concrete sense, we're taking this like zoom out and then zoom in and then zoom back out approach. Whenever we're working with athletes, we're setting up the long range architecture, then we're zooming down into what's going on in the next 1 or 2 weeks. And then we're zooming back out and making sure that those 1 or 2 weeks do in fact kind of fit the narrative of what we want the athlete to do long term.
And some of those examples with, I guess they're more special cases or not, they're the details and not the big picture stuff. But you mentioned there you should have an explanation for why you do a 45-minute recovery run and not a 30-minute recovery run, or why you do 5 times 3 minutes instead of 6 times 3 minutes, I think were the examples. How would you what input would you use to decide on those questions, for example?
It's a myriad of them. I mean, it's how experienced the athlete is, how well they're handling the load, how much do they need. I could just go on and on and on. How long they've been training for, how long the phase is, how fatigued they are within the specific phase. I mean, we've had these coaching roundtables here, these mentorship sessions, where literally we'll go over just a week's worth of prescription for an athlete, and it will take 90 minutes to chew through. And it might be a simple week. It might be a week with, 4 endurance runs and 2 hard runs, and 1 day off, which on the surface seems very, very, very simple. But because we're kind of forcing our coaches to like really dig into that detail, sometimes it just takes a lot to actually process. And it's all in a effort to just make sure why you're doing what you're doing. That's the point that we're always trying to create with those exercises.
Yeah. And I think any coach or athlete, one of the great places to start is to see what has worked in the past for that athlete. And then you sort of have a baseline of what the athlete can handle, what have caused them to improve, and perhaps what periods have not caused them to improve. So those are some additional things that I have found useful to consider as well, when both from the macro perspective and the micro perspective when it comes to a weekly and the workout structure planning point of view.
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously the athlete's history has a big is one of those big input factors, right? Is to use your vocabulary. I always view coaching as you're building a bridge, right? You're building a bridge between where the athlete is at and where they want to go, and it's your job to determine, where to put the spans and how much concrete to use and where to reinforce this, and how long that bridge is going to take to build, and blah, 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 blah. So anyway, so I completely agree with you that some of the inputs are just the, basic athlete history.
Yeah. So let's focus in a bit on the run training aspect of triathlon. Because it's been such a long time since we've done that on the podcast. And I thought that you would be a great person to discuss that with. So first, if we just start simple, what would be your general advice for structuring run training for triathlon?
Well, not to sound like too much of a volume monger, but most people can just stand to run more. I mean, if you were I'm actually doing this exercise right now for an article that's going to come out in a couple of weeks. But if you were to prioritize all the, all the training that you want your athlete to do, or prioritize the things, I guess is a better way to put it, prioritize the things that you want an athlete to do, just the total volume of training has got to be the thing that rises to the surface in terms of the thing that's the most important. And then once you maximize that, and most triathletes or runners have a ceiling to which they start to break down after that, because running is such a kind of an injury riddled sport. So especially most experienced triathletes, most experienced runners, they know, hey, I can get away with 10 hours of running a week or 70 miles of running a week. However, they're just kind of defining their volume, and that sets their upper limit. And then what I have athletes focus on is actually the quality and amount of rest that they get and the nutrition that they're taking in, because those two things kind of serve as the building blocks to reinforce all the work that they've done. And then the fourth thing that I would have them focus on is then, after they've maximized their volume and really optimized their rest and their nutrition, after that, we start to look at the specific training structure within the microcycle or the year or the year as a whole. But it really comes in that order. Really, I think that most runners would be really well served to try to figure out how to maximize their total aerobic volume first, and then try to figure out how to maximize their rest and recovery and nutrition second, and then focus on, whatever kind of mini periodization schemes and things like that they encounter, as kind of a fourth consideration.
So a few follow-up questions on that, because as triathletes training for 3 different sports, the athletes might not be limited by breaking down, but actually by their time available to train, since they have to balance the 3 different sports. So how would you deal with that? Let's say we have somebody who's training 15 hours per week, which is already a lot for an age grouper. Then they need to do some swimming, they need to do some biking, and also running. Are there ways, would you use some sort of block periodization to perhaps get in blocks of larger running volume? Would you perhaps prescribe more running in as a percentage of the whole than what is traditional in triathlon? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's difficult to say because every athlete is going to have a little bit of a unique need. But I think generally speaking, if I'm trying to improve an age group triathlete that is more of a generalist, right, that doesn't have anything really specific, I would honestly start with a run, because that's the most important component of triathlon. You get more bang for your buck. So you improve your fitness 2% on the run, it's going to pay off more than if you improve your fitness 2% on the bike, because of the air resistance, right, that you have in encounter cycling. And running is the last of the 3 disciplines that you're doing. So when you're talking about bang for your buck in terms of what the improvements are going to be and how they manifest into time out on the course, it's always worth it to go with a run. Now, if you have an athlete that has a real specific need, they need more work on the swim, right? They can improve 15 minutes on the swim, just a little bit of work. That's a different kind of kettle of fish. But if you're talking about an athlete that's more of a generalist, I would always have them, and that has been in the sport for a long period of time, I would always have them kind of steer more of their training for improvement to things on the run, simply because that's where most of the time to be gained actually happens.
Yeah, and also you do get a bit more bang for your buck in terms that 45-minute bike ride won't do that much, but a 45-minute run will do a bit more. The volume requirements are just a bit lower overall in running, so that's another consideration.
Yep.
So the rest and nutrition aspects, can you dig into those a little bit?
Yeah, a lot of times we try to focus on, okay, I'm going to do this interval set versus that interval set, or I'm going to do, a 14-mile long run versus a 12-mile long run. Like these really trivial, ways to, as you mentioned kind of at the very beginning of the conversation that we're having, like how to maximize the workload. And before I look at that kind of level of trivial increases in mileage or volume or moving around the interval schemes or things like that, we just make sure the athlete's resting and is taking in adequate nutrition, kind of first and foremost, because those trivial increases are not going to manifest themselves into anything if you're not getting adequate rest. So if they're getting adequate rest, they're sleeping 8 hours a night, it's high quality sleep, they're getting adequate, nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients, then after that point, then you can look at the really, fine tooth comb, look at their training habits. Okay. Yeah. Now we're going to run 14 miles off the bike instead of 12 miles off the bike. Now we're going to do 7 by 3 minutes versus 6 by 3 minutes. You can start to look at those. You can start to look at those things kind of around the edges, but only when the rest and the nutrition is more optimized.
And how do you optimize that? Sleep is pretty evident. You mentioned 8 hours. That's a good standard, although it varies from individual to individual and quality. There are ways to measure that, but you can also just simply feel it. But nutrition, there are a lot of different ideas thrown around. So what's your take on that? What is good nutrition? Is it just back to basics, like eating healthy whole foods, or do you have any specifics that you prescribe? Well,
first off, athletes are horrible at actually knowing how much they need to eat just from a macronutrient standpoint. They're terrible at it. Most athletes they have no idea whether they need 2,000 calories or 4,000 calories during the day. So we just start out with some very basic nutrition or some very basic education on, okay, let's just take an example for an ultra runner. Okay, you have a 3-hour run, right? In that 3-hour run, you're going to burn about 700 calories per hour. So that's an extra 2,100 calories that you're going to need on top of your, I'm just going to use the stereotype of 2,000 calories a day, right? So right there, you're going to need 4,000 calories on that day. Your recovery days are completely different situation. You have your 2,000 calories a day. You might add in for 600 calories for that recovery run. And so your total caloric needs for that day are 2,500, 2,600 calories. So there's this big discrepancy between the hard, long days and the easy days. And we start out with just that. These are the total amount of calories that you're going to need on Tuesday, on Wednesday, on Thursday. And then we break it down to what that actually means. Okay, for breakfast, I'm going to eat this. For lunch, I'm going to eat that. For dinner, I'm going to eat that. But the recommendations are quite honestly boiled down to really, really, really simple stuff. Cover your caloric needs. Make sure that you're not eating junk. It's a success by lack of failure proposition. Make sure you're not eating junk. And that's going to cover almost all of the issues that typically pop up with nutrition and endurance athletes in terms of, if they're deficient in certain micronutrients or, they have a, weird blood profile that pops up during a routine test or something like that. Just make sure that they've got the calories and those calories are not crap is kind of the base point that we're starting from there.
Yeah, I like it. I like it. It's simple enough that people can actually follow it. So that's great. And then we've been talking about this a little bit with the ultra running. Are there things that you've learned from your very successful ultra running coaching career? You've coached some of the best ultra runners in the world. And is it something that you've learned from that could be applied in triathlon?
Oh, that's really interesting. I tend to think that endurance athletes are more similar than different. So I don't know if the lessons learned would be specific to ultra running that could be then applied to triathlon. But one of the things that I kind of keep coming back to year after year is athletes have to have a very acute and tuned in sense of purpose. They have to know why they're doing what they're doing, because the training is hard. And particularly with the elite athletes that I work with, they demand a lot of themselves, and I will then demand a lot out of them during the whole training process. And by a lot, it's not like, we're smashing them with workouts or anything like that. It's a lot of everything. Like sometimes the intensity is, hey, you better make sure that you rest, with reckless abandon. Like you have to make sure that you really focused on your rest. I don't want you taking a 3-hour road trip to, go see Imagine Dragons in concert on your rest day. That's not a rest day. Like you have to be very, very focused on your rest just as much so as your training. And I find that when athletes have a very clear and articulate sense of purpose, that they'll then do the things that they need to do in order to be successful. And I don't think that's any different than any other, than any other high level athlete in any other endurance sports, is that the training is just so hard that you need that higher level of purpose in order to make it all successful.
Even just as a human being, right?
Right.
We don't even need to talk about athletes here. But that's great advice, and I definitely agree. Going back to the run specific discussion, are there some common mistakes in run training other than not running enough that you see triathletes make?
Oh man, well we give triathletes a lot of grief here in our office, as you get very well aware of. They're a unique breed. I would say one of the things that is both a positive and a negative that triathletes always seem to bring to the table is that the first adopters. You even go back to the 80s, right? I mean, they were the first adopters for aero bars in cycling. And sometimes that first adopter or that first mover position is great, right? I mean, they find things out that It sometimes takes years for the other endurance sports to kind of catch up on. And then sometimes it's just nonsense. I mean, sometimes they're just chasing things around, the next gadget, the next recovery widget, the next, nutrition fad or whatever that ends up either not being beneficial and in some cases detrimental to their training and their performance. So it's one of those things that could be like both an asset and a benefit at times, or an asset and a detriment at times.
So are there some examples of those fads or gadgets in present moment that you would say that we are riding the hype wave of?
You're going to get me, you're going to get me to throw people underneath the bus. I think the low carb, high fat thing in triathlon just needs to go away. I think it needs to go away in all endurance sports, and we need to take a more pragmatic, periodized nutrition approach to those things. There's definitely some equipment things, like you remember the old Y bike, right, without the seat tubes that triathletes adopted in the early days, and those have kind of since gone away. They look dumb, and they didn't work all that well either. But I don't know. I mean, those are things that we just like to poke fun at versus things that I think are very material in the whole scheme of things.
What's your take on running power meters?
Oh man. So I just as an interesting anecdote. So Stride, which is one of the running power meter companies, is based up in Boulder, which is just about 90 minutes north of me. I actually might go see them tomorrow, as irony as irony would have it. But I've been not involved, but I would say I've been in touch with them ever since their Kickstarter campaign. And I actually went up there when they got their first production units and kind of took the first one out of the boxing assembly line that they had there in their kind of incubator office, and unboxed the first one in front of them, which was kind of a weird thing to be a part of. But anyway, I think that the better functionality or the better utility with the Stride Pod specifically is just the fact that it can measure the path of the foot. I think that using something that's on your foot to estimate the metabolic power that's required of the athlete has kind of too many faults in it to be of utility from a training prescription or analysis perspective. I think that looking at it through a biomechanical lens could have better utility in it, and they're starting to do that. So then the word power meter really isn't that relevant, right? Which I think is their ultimate flaw, that they're calling it at Stride specifically, that they're calling it a power meter. I do think that if somebody can solve measuring force at the level of a foot or at the level of the foot, just like they do in a biomechanics lab, would have some utility from a training and analysis perspective, or even a kind of a real-time gauge of prescription. But we're a little ways off from having those happen. Although there's some companies out there that are trying to crack that code.
Yeah, I'm sure Nike has already done it. We just don't know it yet.
Yeah, you never know. Yeah, it's a complicated problem. I mean, there's definitely people trying to solve it, but I kind of divide it into this whole running power meter thing into two categories. Is one, the ones that are using motion. In Stride's case, they're using motion at the level of the foot, and some of them use motion at the level of the center of mass, which is actually where Stride started. Not a lot of people remember that. They actually started as having a device that captured motion within a heart rate monitor, and then they use that to calculate the power. But I think that's one category, and I think that if you're measuring that movement at the level of the foot, it's more, the utility in that is more of a biomechanics type of utility versus a workout intensity type of utility, which power would connotate a workout prescription or workout intensity type of utility. And then there's the companies that are focusing on trying to measure force at the level of the foot. And that's kind of a completely different deal. And I think that might actually have some prescriptive utility in an endurance runner setting.
Right. So Related to this discussion, then, how do you prefer to prescribe intensity in running, specifically for athletes? Do you use RPE, heart rate, pace, or does it depend on the context?
Well, for ultra runners, I use RPE. I honestly can't remember the last time I prescribed something via heart rate. It was probably in 2004. It was 14 years ago, maybe. And the reason for that is in trail and ultra running specifically, the conditions that surround the run, so the heat, the temperature, the environment, the altitude, they all affect heart rate to an extent that prescribing something, particularly with a very narrow heart rate range, it just gets lost in the noise. So there's more noise than there is heart rate range that you actually have, and so the prescription kind of becomes null and void. So I switched over to rate of perceived exertion over a decade ago, and I haven't kind of looked back since. And interestingly enough, one of the kind of turning points for me as a coach was actually not in running, was actually in cycling. When I first started coaching cyclists, and this was, if everybody can rewind their brains a little bit, this is 2000, 2001 when I first started working with cyclists. So onboard commercially available power meters were just starting to become more and more available to the public. The price points were coming down. They were more readily available. They weren't as heavy. And so cyclists were using them more and more often out in the field. And previous to that, it was just the people in the Tour de France, basically. And not even all of those guys. I mean, maybe 20% of the riders in the Tour de France were actually using power meters during training, and none of them were using power meters during racing because they were so heavy. But right around 2000 is when they started becoming more and more prevalent, and all athletes kind of had better access to them. And so as coaches, we gradually started to shift our prescription from heart rate to power. And it kind of made us look like idiots, because previously when we're working with an athlete, we'd say, okay, go out and ride at this interval between 150 and 155 beats per minute. And we don't want you to do 4 sets of that interval or whatever. And the athlete would go and do that. And then we switched over to a power meter and we said, okay, I want you to do, 250 watts. The first, interval would be in that same heart rate range. The second interval would be a little bit higher than that heart rate range. The third interval would be way higher than that heart rate range. The fourth interval would be, even higher than that. And so the athletes would come back to us and say, hey, were we prescribing these workouts incorrectly before I was using a power meter? And you kind of had to look at it and go, yeah, we probably should have been doing it a little bit different. So anyway, that's just a long-winded story to kind of backtrack on why I've switched over to rate of perceived exertion and not heart rate, just because there's so many fallacies with using heart rate as an intensity tool when prescribing things for athletes.
So to make it clear, you would for a triathlete, for a cyclist these days that does not have a power meter, you would prefer to use RPE, not heart rate.
Well, for a triathlete that doesn't, for a triathlete, what I would prefer to do is pace on the run, and then RPE second, and then heart rate third. So if I'm using those intensity tools in order, that's the hierarchy that I would use. Yeah. For cyclists, I would use power, and then RPE, and then heart rate.
Okay, got it. I think we're in agreement on that, actually. So although I do use power as well alongside pace for running, because I've been using it and some of my athletes do use it, but I do think that you're right, the metabolic measurement is probably not accurate, but at the same time I think it does an equally good job as the GPS signal of getting sort of the signal through in how hard they're going. So it's not necessarily that much better than pace, but it's equally valid. And there are some other advantages, like if you are in a bad GPS area, then you can still get the power. So there are some advantages I see. But I agree that it's not the best thing since sliced bread.
I agree. I'll agree with you there.
So a couple of more questions then to wrap up. What would be the most useful general training advice that you would give to the listeners? Or advice in general? You talked about purpose, but already, so that might be one. But do you have something else that you want to leave the listeners with? The especially the self-coached athletes?
Yeah, I mean, for the self-coached athletes, it's don't overcomplicate it. Like, you're going to get 90% of it right just with your own intuition, and then the last 10% it's going to take a coach to do. And there are a lot of athletes that makes a difference, right? I mean, that's the difference between winning and not even getting into Olympic final, right? 10%. That's a big difference at that level. But for a lot of athletes, it's kind of inconsequential. So don't overcomplicate it, and to really enjoy the process. I mean, a lot of times, this is a little bit of tag along to Cinnamon I mentioned earlier. We just get caught up kind of in the grind of training. It's really monotonous, and you're doing it for months and months out of the year. You really have to enjoy it. If you don't enjoy it, you're not gonna benefit from it. So it kind of goes along with making sure that you have a solid purpose. You know why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah. And for the coaches listening, there are quite a few of them, and I've already taken a lot of notes from this call. I've found it really useful as a coaching call for a coach. But what will you leave the coaches with as your final piece of advice?
Well, I gave this on the Strength Runner podcast, so I'll give it on this one as well. But it goes along with the mentorship, in the way that one of the ways that we bring that to light now, and this is still so crazy that it boils down to this, is just follow the right people on Twitter and do it in a relentless fashion. Like, don't just take the 280 character tweet as gospel. Like, use it as something that you're going to learn from. When I first started coaching, and when I first started managing and mentoring coaches, we have interns, that would come in for 4 months at a time or whatever. And a big part of their job was just to pull research for our coaches, meaning we would go to them, we'd say, okay, I want you to pull and organize all of this research in this area, and then we're going to work on summarizing it for some sort of professional development or continuing ed that we're doing. And that has largely, not completely, but that's largely been replaced by just following the right people on Twitter and using that as the conduit to develop all of these professional development types of activities that we do here. So anyway, find good mentors and follow the right people on Twitter.
Well, you kindly sent me your list of people to follow on Twitter because I emailed you and asked after listening to that podcast. So to save you to answer a lot of the same email, would it be okay if I post that on the show notes page for this?
Yeah, that's not a problem at all. I probably missed some people, so I'm sorry if I probably missed some colleagues on there. But anyway, I apologize if I missed people. I should have it. That'll be a good start, though.
It was a good start. Very good start. Yeah, so that's about it. Let's move into the rapid fire questions. Take 15 seconds or less to answer these, starting with, what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to endurance sports?
Twitter.
What's a personal habit that's helped you achieve success?
Being organized.
I thought you were going to say being on Twitter.
Yeah, I could keep coming back to Twitter now. Being organized.
Who's somebody in endurance sports that you look up to?
Oh, man. I just got his book yesterday, David Goggins.
David Goggins. Who is that?
Man. He's a former Navy SEAL, ultra runner here based in the U.S. and just has this just incredible life story where he grew up largely uneducated, impoverished, abused. He lived he's an African American and grew up in a really kind of racist part of the country, and just ended up having this, incredible life story where, go read his book, Can't Hurt Me. But he's somebody that, being in ultra running scene here in the US and a Badwater veteran myself, that I've just always really looked up to.
All right. Finally, tell us where we can find out more about you and on website, Twitter, that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So Twitter and Instagram are both Jason Koop. That's spelled with a K, JASONKOOP. You can find me on both those social media handles. And the website is www.trainright.com. You can see all of our coaches and all of our coaching camps that we offer on that website.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason. This has been really great. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on and talk to us this evening.
Yep, absolutely. It was fun.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. I think it was very, very insightful, and it was an honor to have Jason on. He is such a wealth of knowledge and a super experienced and reputable coach. A few of my key takeaways from the discussion were, of course, to always have a very clear purpose, as we discussed. And one way that you can do this when you plan your training, if you're self-coached or if you are a coach, is to sort of peel the onion by diving a couple of layers deeper than just the first answer to your question of why you want to do this workout. So let's say you plan to do some VO2 max intervals. And then you might ask, well, why am I doing this? And the answer is to increase my VO2 max. So that's fair enough, but don't stop there. Dive deeper. So you can ask questions like, is my VO2 max limiting me? Can I already sustain a large percentage of VO2 max for a long time and I need to raise my ceiling to improve my performance? Am I far from or close to my genetic potential of VO2 max improvements? How does VO2 max play into the specific demands of my goal, race, or event? Is the risk-reward ratio of doing this type of workout better than doing something else, like threshold intervals or muscular endurance intervals? So the better questions and the more good questions you ask, the better you can plan your training. And this is not necessarily because you have all the answers. I think that most likely you don't. I know at least that I don't have all the answers when I ask these questions. And I think that probably Jason doesn't either. But asking these sorts of questions, it makes you think. And just because of that, it makes you make better decisions when you plan your training. And obviously, sometimes we fail to do so. I fail to do so, as in the example on the progression runs that we discussed, and I'm very open with that things are not always perfect. You make mistakes and you try to learn from them and improve with time. And that's, by the way, not to say that progression runs aren't great workouts, but the point here was that you should have a very clear purpose for why you're doing them, better than I've done them in the past, and it seemed to work for me. The second takeaway from this episode is in terms of run training, just run more. And that is something that I do agree with, definitely. And there are a lot of examples of athletes that you just increase their run volume, and most of it can be just added endurance running. It doesn't have to be all that hard. But when you have that volume and you keep that volume up over time, then that slowly but surely, it does improve your running. And I'm personally in that kind of phase right now, because a year ago, that's roughly when I got injured again and I started having really serious knee problems. So I didn't run from January through April or May even, end of April perhaps. So I lost a lot of fitness, and since then, well, I improved my running a lot since then. I improved quite quickly. But only now in December, January, have we been starting to really ramp up my run volume. And I feel that even though I'm not in race fitness yet, I'm not peaking by any means, but my base fitness is just so much deeper. And I'm running actually better than I probably ever have, at least in the shorter distances, just because of the fact that we have now had time to, we have a safe distance to my running injury. Things are going great, and we can afford with little risk to ramp up my running volume. And I'm running more kilometers, much more kilometers than I did in the summer, because we were still too close to the running injury that it wasn't worth the risk. But now that I have added those layers of volume and increased volume, it does make a massive difference, more so than any workouts that I'm doing, like specific quality intervals, that sort of thing. So increase your run volume. That would be the second takeaway. As usual, you can find the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. If you have questions or comments, leave them on that show notes page and I'll get right back to you and answer them there. In the next episode on the podcast, I interview Susan Sotir, who's a PhD and the assistant professor at Springfield College. So she's very knowledgeable in the science of endurance sports. And she's also a coach since many, many years at Breakthrough Performance Coaching. So our topic really will be balancing the art and the science of endurance training and how important it is to get that balance right and not fall too far on any one side of it. If you're new to the podcast, you have roughly 165 previous long-form episodes like this to go back to and listen to the archives. I want to point that out, that there's a lot of catching up to do, plus about 50 to 60 other episodes that don't have a number like 166 in this example, but the beginner tips and the Q&A episodes that I do on Thursdays. So there's a lot of catching up to do. Please do that if you are newer to the podcast and you haven't listened to all the archives, because there are some really, really great episodes back in the archives that I highly recommend you go back and listen to. So just want to remind you of that as well. And if you enjoy the podcast, the best way to help keep it going is to tell your friends about it and rate and review the podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, so that more people can find the show, we can grow the podcast, and that helps keep it going and help me to be able to attract great guests like Jason Koop on to the show. So do that, and I am very, very grateful for it. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Get your first box of electrolyte products for free with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. And big thanks to Retül, that you can find on retul.com/TTS. Learn more about the Retül Bike Fit process and find your nearest Retül Bike Fitter. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.